I'm Radha Hegde from the Department of Media, Culture and Communication. I'm delighted to have a conversation today with Professor Susan Ossman, whose book, Moving Matters, Paths of Serial Migration, has just come out with Stanford University Press. Professor Ossman teaches at the University of California at Riverside, where she directs the Global Studies program. Welcome to NYU, Professor Ossman.
Thank you. Thank you.
Her extensive ethnographic work spans continents, and her scholarly research and artistic productions have made significant contribution to the understanding of global processes, the transnational public sphere, urban life, and migration. Susan gave a wonderful talk yesterday about her new book and its connections to drawing out everyday life. And migration is a very rich site where the ordinariness of every day is both highlighted and interrupted. So I was wondering if you could talk about how your work on serial migration speaks to this tension.
Well, obviously, when you're moving from one place to another, there are different notions of what is this place, what is the everyday life in these different places, and how do I fit into it? So there's an assumption sometimes. When we think about everyday life, what are we associating with that? Ideas of habit, maybe habitus. A lot of theorists tell us that these are unconsciously transmitted, oftentimes when we're very young. And obviously someone who's going from one country to another is very much aware of the fact that they're going from, oftentimes we talk about it as the system, or the way people are, or they just gloss it as the country. But there are certain things that others might take for granted that even once people are very comfortable somewhere, they always are thinking, well, oh, in my other homelands, in the other places I've lived, it's different. So there's this constant knowledge about what one is learning in a new place, what one might need to put aside. And so the everydayness is actually both there through a whole set of routines, a way of interacting perhaps with other people, and yet there's always a sense that there isn't this everyday in the sense of an automatic, unconscious habit. The transmission is something one's very aware of.
The richness of the narratives you present is, one of the strengths of your book. And I was wondering if you see in those narratives a sense that the everyday is a site of common shared knowledge, a normative site perhaps, but at the same time a space characterized by acts of transgression, creative transgression, even in small ways, like, for example, language use.
Yes, I mean, of course, once one is playing with these different everydays, one can use language, for instance, to call up some other, in a sense, place or experience, or to highlight certain aspects of one's own identity by using a particular accent, the same word but said otherwise. So these kinds of things can call everyone's attention to the fact of what's being taken for granted. So it might not even be the everyday, it even could be, let's say, what is something that isn't so everyday, like a religious practice or a ritual, for instance, a wedding, or if you do it slightly differently because you've brought some other things into the equation, obviously then everyone is going to become more aware of what their assumptions are about these kinds of events. And that has to do with then thinking about, well, what everyday do I want? What way of construing not just myself, but these social events? How am I proposing that we do this? So it brings it actually to the possibility of having some sort of exchange about it. Sometimes that could be seen as resistance, it could be conflictual, but it might also be seen as quite creative.
So a sort of a defamiliarization of the...
Exactly, and we were speaking about the differences among different disciplinary traditions, and obviously this is something that anthropologists have used as part of their method from the time that we started to do intensive field work at the turn of the 20th century. So this is nothing new to say that anthropologists defamiliarize themselves and therefore see certain things. But one finds, in fact, one of the serial migrants, when I say serial migrants, I mean people who lived in several countries for extended periods of time. One of the women said, but I mean, I am a little bit like an anthropologist. I come and I take it, but it's an anthropologist who has a stake in what's going on in a way that the traditional anthropologist who goes from some academic, setting in New York or Paris or London and then goes to some far-off place and comes back. They don't have the same stake in becoming involved and taking part and becoming an actor in each place in which they're living. So this, it really takes it to another level as compared to the purely academic interest.
It's interesting, the comment that you said one of your respondents made. There are times when one learns from the field, as it were. So I was wondering if you can talk about that experience a little bit more with this particular respondent.
Well, obviously, the field itself is something, it's always been a part of that participant observation. There are different ways of doing field work, but participant observation is really doing things with people, with the idea that you're learning, yes, through conversation, through asking questions, perhaps life stories, even maybe a survey, but you're also learning by doing things physically with people, by learning to appreciate a certain aesthetic and become, whether it's learning to cook with someone, helping them to wash their clothes, these day-to-day tasks, and the idea that through that everyday involvement, through that sensual as well as intellectual involvement in the lives of people, one actually learns something. So I'd say that's fundamental, and there's nothing in my work that's particularly new about that.
Okay.
It's more the places that I've done it in terms of looking at the path of migration as my field site. So a moving field site that changes with each of the people I was interviewing, that's different, but the idea of participant observation is nothing particularly new.
Which leads me to two questions. One is about the term serial in the title itself. There's a sense of seriality in everyday life. There's sort of the ordering, the repetition that normalizes cultural practices, establishes the familiarity that you talked about. And yet, from your narratives, I gather that the very serial mobility or the serial migration unsettles that assumption in a sense.
Well, in some sense it does, and in another it doesn't. By introducing that third move, as an immigrant, there's always this expectation that somehow the immigrant will either go home or fit in, and somehow be assimilated or integrated. There are all these debates about migration. And so my question is, what happens when the immigrant moves on? And one of the theories that drawing on in terms of serial, once it becomes a serial phenomenon that you've moved not once but twice, then all of a sudden you're thinking, well, I could move again. And you may never do that, but there is a way in which there is a practice that you gain, and so therefore one could even say that there is a certain, maybe not habit, it doesn't become every day to move, pick up and move, but much more so. It becomes within the realm of the possible. And there is an element of habit that a lot of people report on, but just in terms of practical things. Well, I've done this before.
Right.
I know the steps to take. I even know how that's going to feel to be in a place where I'm really out of place at first. And because I've done it before, I feel more self-confident. I might not even be approaching this move with great joy. It might be something where I feel I'm doing it for a reason I'm not thrilled with, and yet I'll know how to handle it. So this, in that sense, there is a way in which the migration itself might not be quite every day, but it becomes a practice one is familiar with. There's a familiarity.
Interesting, that it's both routinized and exceptional at the same time.
Yes, and sometimes placed so that it will be very exceptional. In the book I talk about how people use each country kind of as a life chapter. So there's a narrative. This is a very simple structure which everyone has. I lived in this place, then I moved to that place, and using borders not as necessarily what they are, political borders, but also as personal borders. And moments in time. So the country becomes a time period. Oh, I was there from 2003 to 2007. And yes, I know it's not like that anymore. I have no pretense to be an expert on that place or that culture. But my world of the place I lived during that time. Let's say, my Johannesburg or my Mexico City, whatever it is a part of my life, and it's a marker. So even many times there can be this way of saying, okay, I'm done with the everyday here.
Mm-hmm.
There's sometimes maybe something has happened, something extraordinary has happened.
Mm-hmm.
There's an opportunity, there's a moment when someone thinks there's too much everydayness.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's getting really dull here. This is another thing. Oh, it's
too
I have nothing
ordinary.
else to learn here.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll move on.
Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that this serial migration seems to really interrupt conventional understandings of, terms like assimilation, for example. They seem to be scripting their own connections with, the lived experiences
exactly,
of the
when
culture they're in.
When you start thinking, well, my goal here is to, yes, of course, to make it here in a certain sense, to become accustomed to the place I am, learn what I need to learn to get along here. But you start thinking my whole goal is not to, quote, integrate into, but to participate in. You start thinking about it in a very different way than the discourse on someone an immigrant being assimilated into a national culture. And it's also quite different than the idea that somehow, these people are part of this community, which is, this may be a migrant community, diasporas. We use all these different words. Most of these serial migrants also express some degree of distance from other people who may share a language, may share one of their countries. Not that they don't claim that as their own or that they don't have any relationships, but I would say that because of this experience of several moves, they often have, it's very difficult to analyze these people, and perhaps by extension maybe we should start thinking again about how we often do analyze these notions of community or diaspora. It's hard to really fit their stories into a story of diasporic movement necessarily, or of a community, as being representatives of a cultural community where we have these hyphenated identities. Let's say someone who's a Honduran American or Franco-Maghrebi or something like that. They start to disturb that because they collect all of these different places that are their own, and they feel of many of the places, but not only of any one of them.
Right. Given that serial migration is becoming, in a sense, very much a part of the global condition, I was wondering if you can capture, the profiles of a few people that you interviewed.
Well, there are many different aspects of their profiles, and as you know, one of the things one has to be careful about in this work is, what kind of portrait am I painting? At what point in life am I intervening in this person's story? When you're dealing with long-term life stories, that's always a question. How do they see it at this particular time? I could think of, just offhand, telling you maybe a little bit about some of the places that people have gone and how they see that and how they go through this. I think of, for example, Alex, who's from Romania, studied a bit in France, then came to the US for many years, then was back in France for a short time, lived in Iran. Then from Iran he went to Bahrain, and from Bahrain now he was back in Romania and now is in Istanbul, thinking of moving to Bogota. Now this is a man who's probably around 40 years old, so you can see that every 3 or 4 years he's moving quite often. And so some people might say, well, isn't he just some sort of a cosmopolitan, wealthy guy? He's not. He's from a modest background, educated but lower middle class background. And is extremely, it's true, has learned all of these different languages that have been required in each place. He's learned the ways of all these places he's lived. And yet he's not said, I'm just a cosmopolitan. When you ask him, in fact, he plays on his nationality. He always says, I'm Romanian. And he gives examples about the passport that he holds and why he has not gotten another passport, as a way of saying, well, I in a sense, the sense of beating the system, saying, well, nationality doesn't matter, prove it to me, here's my passport. And of course, now Romania is part of the EU, so he has greater liberty of circulation, but he started traveling, before the fall of the Iron Curtain and all of this. So it's quite interesting how people take certain things from this sort of international system and play with them and say, okay, well, here I am. I'm moving even though I don't have one of those good passports, and you're going to give me an American passport, you're going to give me a French passport. No, I'm sorry, I don't want it. So he's one example I can think of who comes to mind. Now, Alex is a single man. He has a partner now, but many people also travel with families. And so this is another, you would think, well, serial migrants, they're probably young. But once people settle down, and so this is something that many of the people I interviewed actually move with their families, and this was quite interesting to see how an entire family the parents will decide to move everyone, and all of a sudden you're starting to have children who speak different languages with greater or lesser proficiency, who've been born in different places, and then within the family how these things get negotiated. So this brings to mind a family that I know who are presently living in Quebec, and where within the family you would say, well, what culture are they? If you listen to their language, you would never really figure it out, because the mother's talking Spanish to her daughter. In order to improve her daughter's Spanish, the mother grew up in Tangiers, which used to be it's right next to Spain in northern Morocco. So the mother grew up speaking Spanish, French, and a local dialect of Arabic. So to each of her children, she starts to speak different languages so that they will all be able to participate fully in the entire story of the family, even if, for instance, the younger boy was born in Canada and doesn't know Moroccan or Spanish, but speaks English quite well now. So this is another really interesting aspect to these migrations, is how does the family create a story? How does a family create a story that's not just the typical, especially in America, we have the immigrant story. My ancestors came, they migrated to this country, they gave all of us a better life, and now we're part of that national story. A serial migrant has to go through several national stories. Which one do you draw on? How do you make that personal story of the cloth of all of these different stories, the bigger stories?
I see what you're saying, that the serial migrant, in a sense, revises the older narrative. But would it be right to say that both migration experiences are in search of following capital, as it were? And perhaps this family the family that you mentioned is trying to create a home through, as best they can, through these sort of interrupted moves. Or would you consider that a fair interpretation?
I mean, I think they are trying to create a narrative, which is not easy to do. Yes, it's a difficult process, because you have, how do you situate with yourself with regard to those around you? The typical way is we have a society, we have a context, we have these narratives that everybody shares. That goes along with the notion of sort of social structure, where we know everybody's position, and it's pretty static. But when you're going across all of these, the way that the serial migrants often resume and say, oh, the system here, the system there, when you're going across that, it does make it harder to construct this narrative. It's not an easy process. Sometimes there are instrumental aspects to it, as you were suggesting, certain kinds of skills, certain languages, say the English language. I'm particularly interested in that. That can be something that people say, we want to give it to our children because they'll be better suited for employment. That can happen. But I've also had examples of people who are English speakers and who, because they themselves have not learned enough languages, that's what they look to their children to do, is to learn other languages, and not necessarily very useful languages from the point of view of, say, employment or capital. There are other ideals at work beside the push and pull of the economy. And many people say they moved to a new place even though they were comfortable,
Mm-hmm.
they decide to move because the future of their children they think of in, say, political terms.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to be in a place where everyone is only, thinking about money or becoming close to the X or Y family that has all of the influence in that country, or maybe they aren't in that family, so they have no possibility to really move beyond a certain point. So there are a lot of considerations that go into what is the thing that we want for our children. What kind of world do we want to live in? And that can include economic factors, but also political, aesthetic, and many social factors, of course. Social mobility is not just about money. It's also about how one thinks about oneself in that place one is. What possible role can I have? What can I do? And not only to improve my role, but to be a good person.
Perhaps I can add affect to that list, because I know you have written quite a bit about affect in your previous work, Three Faces of Beauty, where you study beauty salons in Casablanca, Cairo, and Paris. So I was wondering if you could talk about the role of affect in this thread of your interest in affect, in developing a sort of understanding of public and private worlds, perhaps in this work on immigration.
Yes. Well, with regard to that, actually, I think it might be a good way to come back again to that notion of the everyday. There's a chapter in this book that I say it's the idea is to go from a poetics of space to a poetics of attachment. So I actually use Gaston Bachelard as the beginning point, and in his work on the house, he talks about how the house is this sort of structure that we carry with us. And so, yes, you go to a new home, but your old home is still with you. You go into the kitchen and you turn around thinking you're going to open the refrigerator, and you realize, no, it's not there anymore. It's over here. They're very simple motions that... And so each time you're entering your new home, whatever you designate as a home, there's this habit, there's this habitus that you do bring with you, but also the newness reveals it to you, reveals to you those pasts. And so thinking about that, I was thinking about how each home, but also each country is a little bit like that for Syrian migrants, going through these different places. And one thing that Bachelard does not talk about very much is really who are these other people that make up that home. Because of course the composition of the people one lives with, or one might live alone, but the people who one is able to be in contact with in each new place will be slightly different. And yet there are things that follow. So one of the things that follow are these very strong, effective relationships to other people and to places through people. One of the ways people talk about place is not just, oh, I was living in Germany. It's like, oh, my friend, Helga. Helga is Germany for me. And so you'll hear this way in which there are often people who say make you fall in love with a place because you fell in love with them. People talk about love and how that happens. And okay, well, why did many people serial migrants move to be with someone, not just picking up an already existing family and moving on. And so these threads of attachment and this poetics of thinking how we attach, not how we necessarily create networks of the kind that we often look at in the network society, but more, what kind of a knot do I tie with this person? How do I keep that attachment even when I move? And I know, obviously, technological changes have made that easier in certain ways. They've changed the tenor of that affective relationship. And then, of course, in each place where we live, we have different ways of relating to people, ways that I think go across borders. I think there are certain interactive habits, regardless of language, regardless of place, that do cross borders. And it's not because they share culture, but because they share certain ways of sort of easing us into interactions. I don't know if you want me to go into the whole thing of the three worlds here, but it's something that came from the beauty salon work, and which I've developed further in the work on serial migration, where, to put it simply, I thought of these different kinds of social spaces, not in terms of, say, we've got a school, we've got a cafe, we have a beauty salon, but internally, what kinds of schools are there? What kinds of beauty salons are there? And in my work on the salons, for instance, I found that I identified 3 different types of salons that existed in all of the places I was looking at in different measure. A type that I would characterize as sort of graphically as a circle, where people sit around, comment on one another. A place I would think of as a grid, the kind of world we think of as related to rational modernity, where each person gets a vote, where we get certified to get a diploma or to perform a certain job according to specific skills. Or another world which is more charismatic, which we often forget about. And of course there's been some work much work now in the media realm about the creation of stars and celebrities. But I suggest that even on a day-to-day basis, we have our small celebrities that we know in our world, whether it's the high school football player, whether it's the local politician, and rotating around these worlds, we have a very different set of values than we would bring, say, to this modern rationalized world, where that politician may not actually add up to much, and yet she has that special something that brings us all to listen to her and somehow sums up what we feel. So thinking about how these kinds of worlds go across borders and actually are coexisting in all modern societies led me to then analyze the stories of serial migration and why people might choose certain places, or why they might feel more comfortable in one place than another in terms of their experiences of these 3 types of social settings, and the way that different states particularly, because it is often a political question of how you order these worlds, what is the place that we give to something like charisma in our politics?
Right. Which, the very fact that these worlds are overlapping and the borders are blurring is a challenge for an ethnographer. So I know in your own work you make a comment in the 3 Faces of Beauty that the field can no longer be depicted on a map, that rather one needs to move through connections and make linked comparisons. So, you set out the path that one needs to follow images, follow pictures, follow people. So I was wondering if you can comment on this as a sort of a modus operandi for your own work.
Yes, definitely. I've thought throughout many of the projects, thinking about how to develop a more mobile form of ethnography. I don't think I'm alone in that, but certainly I've done it in a number of different fashions. And thinking about the paths of serial migration was not really just a project to think about serial migrants, although I have a particular interest in that life path and an interest in seeing how where we go makes us who we are. This is a question that I asked from my very first work when I noticed how, even within a city, how one can move, whether one is male or female, whether one is educated or illiterate, whether one feels at ease in certain milieu, how is really going to determine not just our physical mobility, but who we hang out with in a simple sense, who we're able to interact with, and how we're able to interact with them. Hence the idea of these 3 different worlds. People move among those. They don't necessarily only live in one of them. But then the problem is, how do we associate them? When do I bring the values of the face-to-face circle of the proximate world? Where do those values belong and where don't they? Sometimes we might say in certain circumstances that if I bring those goods or those ways of judging things into, say, my professional relationships, that might be seen as favoritism. Okay, so that might just be a small example of why, say, one of the interviewees who I interviewed in Montreal said, although he's unemployed, his wife is employed, although life is not easy in Canada, it's freezing cold in the winter, he would never move back to Morocco because the notion of good is different, and it has a lot to do with, he feels that the state and the society ought to favorize more this sort of rationalized, everybody's equal, everyone should have a chance. These are his ideals, in a sense, that he sees as not exclusive, that there should be other ways of judging things within the family or within certain circles. But he sees his friends who are telling him what a great life he could have had sitting on a cafe in Marrakesh being waited on by servants. He sees that as problematic because it's bringing a different set of values into the forefront.
So you mentioned yesterday that in your talk that the book is out now, based on a number of years of field work and interviews, but there's also a sense that you're continuing this work with the workshops that you've done with artists, and so the scholarly work has acquired another performative dimension to it. So could you tell us more about it?
Yes, this came out of a series of projects I've been doing involving the arts. I paint myself and make art of various other kinds. And it really came up when I was asked to present the book. We all know we publish a book. It's going to be criticized in various, or put forth in various academic journals. There may be some people outside of academia who read it who have a special interest in that particular topic. But I thought that it would be really interesting to respond differently to the book. So I'm creating sort of a template for workshops that bring together serial migrants who are artists or are writers, dancers, musicians, who read the book and instead of coming up with an academic critique, come up with an artistic commentary on these issues. So it corresponds to in a sense, a new stage of the research, where obviously some of the people I interviewed in the book will not be able to do this because they're not artists, because they haven't had access to this kind of training or the media such as video or music. But among those who participate, it will also create further conversations because there'll be the performance, there'll be conversations, we're filming it, and hopefully that'll lead to another stage of research which could have multiple outcomes, whether it's through artistic work itself and exhibitions and performances, or through maybe the creation of some new online community, or perhaps further academic writing about the same subject, treating things that didn't get into the book.
I know you are planning that, and we all look forward to your theorizing what this would eventually lead to. It's an amazing way of braiding together scholarship and everyday life. Thanks for your very compelling ideas about not only migration and globalization, but also about the process of doing ethnography. Thank you very much.
Thank you.